Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In today's video we will be revisiting the Tomb Kings of Khemri. However, the focus will be the King of Kings, the Monarch of the Sky, the Ruler of the Four Horizons, the great Settra the Imperishable. As always, I will be assuming you have some knowledge of the Tomb Kings and their society, and if you do not, I recommend watching my previous Tomb King Society and Mortuary Cult and even the Tomb King Army videos if you want more details into what they once were and what they are currently. Also, I would like to note that I am pulling the majority of this information out of the 8th edition Army books and the Nagash novelizations, and if you have seen any of my previous lore content, you will know that I often make no promises of correct pronunciation, so I do apologize in advance if I trigger anyone, as I will undoubtedly get some of these Egyptian-inspired names wrong, and just my general English. So, with that out of the way, let's get this into the lore proper. Settra was born as a prince to his father, the current king of Khemri. During this time, the lands of Nehekara were divided, with each city acting as its own minor kingdom, complete with their own kings. As well, this was the time of strife for the Nehekarans. The once prosperous land was drying up as the river Vitae had not flooded in decades, and therefore disease and death was commonplace in the once prosperous desert oasis cities. As well, the lizardmen of the Southlands were attacking the Nehekarans, obviously from the south, while vicious bands of greenskins and marauders were attacking from the north. The once powerful cities were bent low by both their enemies and the unrest of their people as they starved in the streets. Settra, as was custom, served in his father's army. It was schooled in the ways of war and battlefield tactics. He was a veteran soldier, around his 15th birthday, having crushed rebellions and the armies of rival kings. His time leading his father's armies took him across most of Khemri, and he faced all forms of monsters and humans. But his cunning and knack for combat prevailed over time, and he was seen as a hero amongst his people. He seemed to be destined for greatness, and this would not be any more self-evident than when he finally took power over Khemri with the death of his father. Settra knew from his experiences as a soldier and general that a man alone could not quell the unrest in his kingdom, and Settra had plans to not only bring order and glory to Khemri, but to all the world as he knew it. And so he decided that he would plead with the gods of his people for strength and the means to accomplish his dreams of a world-spanning nation. To this end, upon his coronation, Settra sacrificed his children in a grand ritual to appease the gods. It is unknown in what way this was done, but judging from later documentation of Nehekaran sacrifices, I would assume that his children were purified through meditation and then burned upon a pyre and offered to the Nehekaran pantheon. To the surprise of many, the next day the river Vitae flooded for the first time in centuries, and that year the plague and famine that had plagued the lands was lifted. Settra became the first priest king, a ruler chosen by the gods themselves to guide his people to glory and order, a title which would be passed down to all future rulers of Khemri in years to come. After his ascension, Settra proceeded to conquer the neighboring Nehekaran lands, starting with Numas, then with the port city of Zandri. He did this through acts of extreme violence and oppression, which would come to characterize Settra's rule over his people. He demanded complete loyalty and devotion, and crushed all forms of insurrection with overwhelming force and cruelty. After he claimed the ports of Zandri, Settra's empire soon stretched from the seas of Araby to the dark lands of the east. All of Nehekara was under his rule, either directly or through subservience and tribute. He did allow individual kings to rule their cities, but they had to swear their loyalty to Khemri and himself above all else. Once all the combined strength of the various dominated cities was brought together, it was not long after this that the lizardmen were driven back into the jungle of the Southlands, and the orcs and human barbarians from the north were repulsed. With the kingdoms of his ancestors secure, Settra set out to faraway lands to assert his dominion. There are accounts of raiding along the coast as far off as Cathay, and even reports of Khemrian raids upon the jungles of Lustria, enriching the vast treasury of Settra. The expansion of Nehekara traveled north from what is known to the Land of the Dead, through the Badlands into the territory that would be known as the Border Princes and Talaya. It was from the tops of these specific mountains that border what is now the Empire that Settra realized that his quest for global dominion would not be possible. No matter the foe or army, he had always overcome and reign supreme, but he was beginning to feel the ravages of time, and knew that one day, not long from now, he would inevitably die. But how was that fair? Was he not the chosen of the gods, the one and true rightful ruler of all the lands? With that dilemma at hand, Settra called forth all of the high priests, sorcerers, scholars, and healers that existed through his vast empire, and set them with a task. They would find a way to allow their king to live forever, and thus the mortuary cult was created. They began to compile research in faraway lands and forbidden rites to appease the King of Kings. Through this new form of sorcery and science, Settra's life was extended well beyond that of any normal man, but still he felt himself growing weaker, until finally he lay on his deathbed. The high priests of the mortuary cult were summoned and demanded to produce results for their studies. It is during this time that I believe that the mortuary cult had infiltrated some of the Lizardmen temple cities, either through conquest or through spies, and learned of the arts of embalming. This, in conjunction with the knowledge of Arabian herbs and spices, and possibly the knowledge brought back from the Far East, allowed the high priest to inform Settra that though they did not have the means to grant him immortality now, they did believe that they could, with time, summon a soul back from the realm of souls into the mortal lands once again. The King of Kings would be brought back to life and would rule in all his glory and splendor for eternity. With a curse dying on his lips, the great Settra passed from this world and into the realm of souls. For a time. His body was embalmed and placed in a massive pyramid made from the white marble that reflected the sun in such a way that no mortal could look directly at it. The Great One was also interred with a vast army and his most powerful champion, Nekaf, a northern barbarian with a knack for battle. Nekaf, as well as the army, artisans, slaves, and other various war machines and servants, were buried alive with their lord to serve him in the next life. Slowly they suffocated as the pyramid was filled with sand. And this is where we leave Settra's story briefly until his resurrection. Many centuries passed, and the mortuary cult did in fact attempt to keep their promise to the King of Kings. That is, until the rise of Nagash, the great necromancer, and during his time as a man, the head of the mortuary cult. I do plan on making a full video on Nagash, but for now, just know that he was the second son of the current ruler of Khemri, and this is centuries after Settra was interred in his great pyramid. However, Nagash was a vain and power-hungry man and desired to be the ruler of all of Nehekhara, but was denied this by his birthright as the first son of every king, since Settra was offered to serve the gods, and Nagash had essentially been forced into the priesthood of the mortuary cult. Nagash showed great promise in the form of sorcery, and through the death of his father and the tribute of another city, he came into possession of 3 dark elf slaves. Recognizing them as the ones who struck his father down, he interrogated them and learned the ways of magic, particularly the Wind of Dar, or dark magic. This powerful magic, in conjunction with his vast knowledge of death and human anatomy, allowed him to develop an entire new lore of magic, the lore of vampires, though at the time vampires did not yet exist, so it was simply just a separate lore of magic. A lore of undeath, if you will. The story of Nagash from here gets rather complicated, but suffice to say that he developed an elixir from the blood of living sacrifices that granted essentially immortality in the form of superhuman strength and abilities as well as youth. He brought it to several low-level nobles and colleagues in his coven of immortals, as they were known, and taught them the ways of sorcery and his new lore of magic. Of course, he didn't teach them everything, but this is where Arkan the Black makes his appearance, and his fate is forever intertwined with that of his now master. Through the use of his entourage and the leader of the mortuary cult, as well as several assassinations and bribes, Nagash overthrew his brother and took over the kingdom of Khemri, and therefore the rule of all of Nehekhara. Of course, his ambitions could not be sated by this, and he continued his studies into the Wind of Dar, and through various experimentations he became the first necromancer, able to bind the corpses of the dead into a parody of unlife. Not only this, but he began to develop further monstrosities and horrors made from the bones of animals and men in parody of the gods themselves. Really anything he could actually imagine he could actually make from bone. Drunk with power, Nagash's pride, much like Settra, led him to scorn the gods and desire to become a god himself. For why should he not be seen as a deity, as he was the first human to conquer death, and the ruler of the greatest civilization of the world? With this desire in mind, he proceeded to tax and bankrupt this great civilization in the construction of his great black pyramid, made from black marble as pure as midnight. It took over 100 years for this pyramid to be built, and the cost plunged the nation of Nehekhara into debt and squalor. But eventually, it was completed. However, the subsidiary kings of the other great cities rose up in anger at the treatment of their people at the hand of Nagash, and openly rebelled against the usurper, as he would forever be known. This was when the necromancer revealed his true colors and raised the Nehekharan dead to fight the living. There could be no greater insult to the people of Nehekhara than the desecration of the sacred dead. After a long and costly campaign, Nagash was defeated by the combined strength of the priest kings, but not before the great necromancer destroyed the Nehekharan people's connection with their deities by corrupting his former brother's wife and the representation of the covenant of the humans and their gods. You can think of her as almost like the Ever-Queen of the High Elves, and that with her corruption, the miracles that helped the various cults of the Tomb King's pantheon combat the undead ceased to work. And was it not for the intervention of King Settra of Lamia and his use of essentially handheld cannons from the lands of Cathay, this very well might have been the end of life as we know it. But this did not come to pass, as Nagash was heavily wounded and thought dead, though his body was never discovered. His armies crumbled to dust, and only the immortals remained, with Arkhan the Black playing the part of a distraction while his master slipped away, and he was finally brought down by a nameless soldier's javelin through the heart, with a curse dying on his lips that whoever should disturb his body would come under some great catastrophe. Attempts were made by the kings to destroy all evidence of Nagash, but his pyramid still remained, as did many of his books, and unlikely the corpse of Arkhan survived, whereas most of the immortals were beheaded and burned to ash. Now, Nagash was banished from Nehekhara and was not heard of from hundreds of years, though he vowed revenge on the kings of Khemri, and he would one day return to claim what was rightfully his. During this time, Lamia became one of the most prosperous cities in the empire and wielded great influence over Nehekhara after their great intervention in the defeat of Nagash, until it was discovered that the books of Nagash were indeed not completely destroyed. With the banishment of the great necromancer, and Neferata, with the aid of the secretly re-arisen Arkhan the Black, was accidentally turned into a vampire, the first of her kind. A scandal through which the kin of the kings of Khemri once again united to drive the undead from their lands, and they were rather successful. And through their leadership of the future King Al-Khadi-Zar, the Conqueror, they were pushed from Nehekhara and driven into the open arms of Nagash and his new lands of Nagash-Zar, or Cripple Peak, if you will. Through the discovery of the vampires, the kings were warned of not only Nagash's arrival, but that he would be returning soon, and so they did not sit idly by, and finally when Nagash was ready to strike out at the kingdoms of Nehekhara, he was met with stiff resistance, and through the tactical genius of Al-Khadi-Zar, he was once again defeated at the hands of mere mortals. It was then that Nagash decided that, if he could not rule the living, he would simply rule the dead, and through an unsteady alliance with the Skaven, he had the river Vitae poisoned, which would forevermore be known as the River Mortis, and the once prosperous lands of Nehekhara became the lands of the dead. When Nagash returned, he easily swept aside all resistance and claimed his new kingdom, imprisoning Al-Khadi-Zar in the dungeon as a sacrifice for his greatest spell he had ever created. The spell would have allowed Nagash to flood over the Warhammer world in a tide of undead and bring ruin and death to every civilization, were not for the intervention of a most unusual hero. The first part of Nagash's spell killed every living thing in Nehekhara and raised it back into unlife. The second part of the ritual would be to bind these undead to Nagash's will, but he needed time to recover from the impressive display of sorcerous might. The Skaven, not being the best of trade partners, had tried to kill Nagash several times in the past, and let's just say that they were well aware of how easily he could turn their best assassins inside out. And so in secret they forged a sword of pure warpstone with every curse and poison they knew to imbue upon its blade. It would be known as Fellblade, and even simply wielding the sword would be a death sentence. And so the Skaven pawned off the destruction of the very much weakened Nagash onto Alcatizar, his prisoner. They showed up in the dungeon, freed him, left the sword on the ground, and pointed him in the direction of the necromancer. What happened next was a rather one-sided fight, as Nagash, in his fear of his subordinates attempting to take advantage of his weakened state, had sent everyone away, and he was left completely unguarded. Alcatizar then chopped him into teeny tiny pieces, and soon after died from the effects of Fellblade. Though not as soon as you would be led to believe, but that is also a story for another time. For Alcatizar is a very special individual indeed, and he probably deserves his own lore video, but we will be getting a good glimpse at him whenever I finally get to Neferata. Now, this is supposed to be a Settra video, and I'm going to get to that shortly, I promise. With Nagash dead, the undead simply collapsed, except for the past kings, an elite retinue of the Nehekarns that were embalmed and warded. You see, the spell had an unusual side effect of these undead, as they retained essentially their souls and therefore their personalities. Of course, with hundreds of kings awakening at the same time, they all made an attempt to claim their previous lands, which would also be the same lands of all the other kings. Needless to say, a great civil war amongst the undead encompassed Nehekhara, and would have continued to do so if not for the intervention of Grand Hierophant Katep, the last and oldest leader of the mortuary cult. He approached the Great Pyramid of Settra, for the King of Kings still slumbered, protected by the powerful wards placed on his tomb that protected him from Nagash's spells. Katep brought the King of Kings back into this world, and he proceeded to quell the unrest in Nehekhara through his indomitable will and might. Settra then placed the majority of the Tomb Kings back into slumber, never to rise unless he would need their strength. He then placed several somewhat trustworthy kings, and even a queen, to rule over and protect the borders of Nehekhara while he figured out what he was going to do next. He learned from the Grand Hierophant Katep all that had happened in his absence, and most importantly, why he had been brought back into this world in his desiccated state and not in the utopia he was promised all those centuries ago. Settra, needless to say, was furious at the ineptitude of the mortuary cult and banished the Grand Hierophant from his lands until he could come up with a way to fix what his order had promised the now Unperishable. It was then that Settra took stock of the damage and state of his empire and began to rebuild and assert his will over any upstart kings that dared challenge his rule. It was during this time that Arkan the Black was discovered to be undermining Khemri, and finally, after thousands of years, Nagash was reborn in his Great Black Pyramid. He was aided by Arkan, and he demanded fealty from the now Tomb Kings, as he saw them as undead, and he was the ruler over all undead. They did not go over fairly well, as most of the kings saw Nagash as the cause of their current predicament and the fall of their civilization. And they were in fact right to do so. But the one who took the most offense was Settra the Imperishable. As Settra does not serve, he rules. And he personally led a campaign against the usurper and pushed him out of the lands of the dead. A most impressive feat, though Nagash was nowhere near his optimal power, but still defeating any form of Nagash in battle is a great achievement, as he is almost at this point a god. This led Nagash into the heart of the empire, where he would face off against a certain barbarian chieftain. I think his name was Sigmar Heldenhammer or something such as that. It involved Nagash's crown, but this is about Settra, and as far as we are concerned, Nagash was defeated and his lands once again safe. After the defeat of Nagash, during his new rule of undeath, he was constantly plagued by the raids from the Greenskins and various other human treasure hunters, desecrating his lands and stealing the amassed wealth of Nehekhara. It was after nearly a millennia that a band of Norse marauders, led by Valgard the Butcher, a chaos champion, were found plundering the tombs of the Tomb Kings. Settra raised an army and managed to catch them by relative surprise. If you know anything about Norskins, and if you don't, you should definitely check out my Norse Society videos, you should know that they don't break at the sight of immediate danger the way most human nations do. In fact, they often relish a chance to impress their gods, even perhaps garnish favor from their patron deities. And so, the Norskins squared off against the enemy of skeletons and constructs, surviving volleys of blessed arrows, an attack of massive packs of carrion, and the chariots of Settra's legions. Despite the great skill of the Norskins, however, They were losing in this battle of attrition. Not only would they tire, but they were not used to fighting in the heat of the desert, and so in an attempt to break the enemy, Valgar bellowed a challenge to what he believed to be the leader of the Tomb King army. It was none other than Settra, and he happily met the mortal in battle. The King of Kings, however, may have underestimated this chosen of the dark gods, and he received a wound by the champion's flame-wreathed axe to his chest. His body burst apart into thousands of beetles, which quickly devoured the flesh from the Chaos Champion before spiriting away to Khemri to allow the Imperishable to recover from his wounds. A retreat of the Norskins was sounded and led by Valgar's second-in-command, that made to retreat to their longboats. Amidst the carnage, Valgar's lieutenant, Calgar Bloodfist, stooped down to pick up Settra's regal crown before rallying the surviving tribesmen and cleaving a path through the skeletal shield wall back to the coast. Only a dozen marauders managed to survive and escape back to their frozen realm, bloodied, but rich beyond their wildest dreams. It was a decade before Settra re-emerged from his sarcophagus, his body restored but his heart burning with the need for vengeance. The men of the north had not only dared to enter his realm, soiling the desert with their barbaric feet, they had the temerity to face him in battle, even going so far as to strike him down. However, most heinous of all their crimes had been the bold act of laying their low-born hands upon the crown of Nehekara, a deed that brought with it a sentence of death. Settra the Imperishable would punish the barbarians for their insolence by staining the sands of their homeland red with their blood. The king of Nehekara turned to his lich priests and ordered them to waken his vassal kings. The combined might of Nehekara's armies was going to war. Settra's war fleets sailed north towards the frozen wastelands, laden with legions of undead soldiers and war constructs. The king of Nehekara swore that only when the last gold coin was recovered, and every one of the barbarians who had escaped his wrath a decade ago was slain, would he then return to Khemri. Each of those men had become a chieftain in his own right, with the wealth they brought back from the land of the dead, securing them much power and many followers. Several had become champions of chaos, and now they led whole tribes of merciless warriors and mutated monsters. The army of the Tomb Kings systematically crushed all of these treacherous marauders and painted the snow red with their blood. But the crown was not found until Settra finally hunted down the last of the marauders, Calgar Bloodfist. During this great battle, it was Prince Apophas, a character that may deserve his own video one day, engaged the Chaos Champion in personal combat and struck him down by opening his throat with his cursed dagger. With the death of their champion, the Marauders' morale broke and they reverted to their base berserk nature and were easily struck down by Settra's legions. But the heavily armored Chaos Warriors and their monsters did not. That was until the Chariots began to hew into their ranks and even they finally broke. It took 2 days to hunt down all of the mortals, and the battle finally ended with Settra personally weathering a hailstorm of lightning to decapitate a dragon ogre Shaggoth. With the marauders dead and their crown finally reclaimed, Settra set back for his kingdom, walking over those who had wronged him, as they would be a lesson to any who would cross his path in life, and even more so in death. Truly, Settra would suffer no disrespect. And with Settra's return to Nehekara, this finally brings us up to the current timeline, relatively of what Total War Warhammer is, with Settra having ruled over his lands, finally seeking to expand and reconquer the rightful place of all Nehekaran society, and possibly completing his goal of global domination. As far as Total War is concerned, I think that they nailed Settra's look and playstyle. He has access to many of his magical items that he had in tabletop. First being the Crown of Nehekara, which is actually the crown of incorporated several other crowns into one, essentially in a similar way that the Egyptians used to. I believe there was 2 kingdoms that they combined a crown, something like that. I don't remember the exact wording or how it went, but I remember several crowns being combined into one, and this is the same with the Crown of Nehekara. It is essentially the crown of various other city-states that were combined to make the high-ranking crown of the King of Khemri. Now, he also has the Chariots of the Gods, which we didn't really go over, but it was something that was given to him during his coronation time, blessed by the gods. This mighty chariot carries with it the blessings of all the gods and goddesses of Nehekara, and its wheels blaze with mystical fire, and he can ride that into battle, as well as a Khemrian War Sphinx, which is nice, but the Chariot of the Gods is personally, that's his most iconic mount. In the tabletop, he also has the Scarab Brooch of Usurian. Usurian is the Lord of the Dead. If you haven't seen my Tomb King Pantheon video, I recommend checking it out. It is made in the image of a skull carapaced Kepra beetle, I believe is how you say it. This talisman surrounds the wearer with the protective energies of Usurian, god of the underworld. Unfortunately, we did not get this item, and I'm really not sure why, as it obviously is just a word save, but perhaps with all the other buffs between all his other magical items, it would have made him a little bit too overpowered for more than likely multiplayer purposes, because in my opinion, the campaign, it really wouldn't matter because of the way the AI gets stacked with buffs and whatnot. So he also gets the Blessed Blade of Petra. This revered weapon has been blessed by the sun god Petra. The blade's white-hot edge, infused with the head of the desert sun, sets the air itself ablaze and glows so brightly that it blinds Settra's foes. Now, they did give us the Blessed Blade of Petra, and it functions much in the way you would think. And I do like the fact that they actually added the blinding effect, and it debuffs all enemies that Settra comes into contact with, which is very powerful when you're on a chariot, as they tend to not have very high defensive stats. And with that, I believe we have finally come to the end of this lore video on the great Settra the Imperishable. For he does not serve, he rules. Before you go, however, I would like to say thank you to all of my loyal subscribers, and we are fast approaching the 1,000 subscriber mark for the channel upon the release of this video. I just never thought we would get this far, but all of the support and encouragement is much appreciated, and it is really what keeps me making these lore videos for all of you guys, and I would just like to tell you my personal thanks. If you are not a subscriber, feel free to both like this video, as it will help more people see this content, as well as subscribe and join the Cult of Thick. That might not be the best name, but we will workshop it. As always, I have been Jumbo Thick. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys all very soon in my next video. Have a good day.